Today's topic is fall lawn care, a very relevant, timely topic for this season and the weather we're having right now. So one of the things that I always like to kind of bring into this conversation at the beginning, grass growth cycles. So we are in the Mediterranean climate of the Pacific Northwest, and what that means for grass and for weeds and for some of our native bulbs is that with the shortening days, cooling evenings, and increased moisture and beginning of precipitation, fall is spring to these plants. This is the beginning of their growing season. You can trick them into doing more outside of their growing season through the summer, but their natural habit of grasses in this environment is to start growing about October, grow through the wet season, and to go dormant around June or early July. You want to work with that pattern, and that's why the fall lawn care is such a critical topic. Keep in mind that the things you're going to do at this time of the year really do kind of set the stage for the rest of the season. If you're going to continue your lawn green, great. All these steps will help you do that better. If you're going to let your your grass dormant down in the summer, all these steps will help you have a more healthy lawn going through that dormant period and coming back out the following season. So first of all, I want to talk about just some of the basic maintenance things that you should be looking at on an ongoing basis in the fall. Basic fall maintenance. Mowing is one of the big questions. So I always encourage people to fight their base instincts of wanting these perfectly clipped, ultra low lawns like you see in the photo here. There's a tendency amongst homeowners with lawns to really want to keep that thing scalped back at 3/4 of an inch or an inch tall so that it barely makes it over the tops of your shoe soles, let alone the tops of your shoes. That's really not healthy for turf. For the types of turf we grow in the valley, we really want to have you mowing generally through the season, something around 3 or 4 inches, or basically as high as you can possibly set your mower. That being said, we've gone through a summer cycle now, and coming into the fall cycle, we would like to do a little bit harder cut, just to take out some of the older growth and some of the thatch materials, and to enable a more vigorous growth response as the grass naturally starts its growing cycle. So we'd like to see your first significant mowing in the fall, meaning if you're irrigating, could be any time now. If you're not irrigating after the growth begins in October, substantially lower, maybe half the height you would normally maintain it, maybe 1.5 to 2 inches down. And the comments I always get in these classes at that point is, 2 inches is low? Yeah, 2 inches is low, a low cut for perennial rye or perennial types of red fescue and hard fescues. So bring it down 1.5 to 2 inches now, but going forward for mowings later in the fall and as mowing resumes in the spring, we really want you to get that up to 3 or 4 inches. It provides a more healthy lawn situation. Lime is often added as a supplement to fertilization, not to replace fertilizer, but as part of your fertilization program. Whether you need lime or you don't need lime can be determined by pH tests. In general, we assume you really should lime once or maybe twice a year here in the Willamette Valley, but different soil pHs can change that somewhat. Fall is a great time to put lime down. If you're going to skip a liming, skip your spring one. The fall one is really, really important. And a granular lime product is put down. Now, there's a lot of different granular limes you can use. You'll see dolomite limes, you'll see fast-acting limes, you'll see prilled limes. What we really like to see going down is a relatively slow release or moderate release granular limestone, not a lime flour, not a powder. Lots of brands out there. I've got High Yield's fast-acting lime now. Dolomite's a little different in that it is a mixture of calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate. For lawns, it really doesn't matter. Putting the lime down in any form is good. In your vegetable garden, it matters if you're using a calcium lime or a magnesium lime. So you might put that into your thought process before you buy lime if you're intending to use it both directions. For a vegetable garden, you want calcium limes only. You really don't need the magnesium. Fertilization, obviously the beginning of the growing season for turf, so let's give it some nutrients to go on. In addition, the wet weather will kind of strip out some nutrients. Basically, as we're getting to the fall cycle, we want to get enough nutrients for the grass to get growing, but we don't want to push so much fertilizer that you're going to be trying to mow heavily all through the winter because it's constantly growing and getting way too long. So it's ideal to use a slow release fertilizer. And there's a couple of different directions you can apply slow release fertilizers. You can apply a commercial winterizer lawn fertilizer. Those are typical lawn fertilizers have been formulated for an even slower release than traditional patterns. They should last for 3 to 4 months, basically. Or you can simply use an organic lawn food. Organic lawn foods are naturally slow release and won't promote excessive growth going into the wet season. It's worth mentioning at this point in time in this presentation that there's a lot of different information out there you'll pick up about what to feed your lawns. And one of the concerns we have is that a lot of the old school ways of fertilizing a lawn, like using 16-16, 16-16-16 fertilizers, have some concomitant problems, mostly pollution. Grass really doesn't use phosphorus to speak of. It's that middle number on your fertilizer bag. Grass really needs nitrogen. Ideally, you want a little bit of that nitrogen to be available fairly quickly, but most of that nitrogen to be released over a slow period of time. Potassium, potassium is beneficial. Lots of potassium is seldom very essential. So ideally, you want to find a fertilizer that has lots of the first number, little or no, like 0 or 1 for the middle number, and a moderate amount of the third number. And that makes a good lawn food as long as it's kind of a stable release pattern. So a typical winterizer might be an 18-0-12, but the 18 being fairly time released. Organic lawn foods are something usually around an 8-2-4, roughly, something in those kinds of number ranges. So that's what you want to be feeding. Don't get into the mistake of putting straight ammonia on. That's really hard to manage. So straight ammonium nitrate or straight ammonium sulfate are acidifying, which lawn doesn't particularly like, as we mentioned under lime. And they're really hard to do without burning because they're so instantly available and they have no sustenance, no sustaining power. And don't get into the mistake of using like 16-16-16 or 20-20-20 fertilizers because all of that phosphorus just ends up in the river creating algae problems. Some optional maintenance things that are on the basic maintenance grouping of tasks, using a soil activator. So there's a couple of different types of soil activator, but the dominant ones we're seeing for lawn use are humates, humic acid. What the humic acid does is it provides a foundation for soil biology. And one of the things we always encourage with all planting and all plant fertilization is understanding that you have two choices in feeding. You can try to provide immediately available nutrients that the plants can use themselves directly, soluble nutrients, things that dissolve into water and plants can absorb. But almost anything that is not instantly soluble it requires some soil biology of some sort, some mycology, some fungal organisms, or some bacterial organisms to break it down. So we really want to encourage a healthy soil, and then you feed the soil and let the soil feed the plants. And the same thing in a turf as in other plants. So soil activators promote active soil biology. This will increase better fertilizer utilization, better water management, both the ability to tolerate a little more wet, but particularly later in the season to tolerate dry. When you have a lawn situation, you'll usually have plants around or planted in the lawn, trees, shrubs, that may drop leaves, and debris, and detritus on that lawn. It is important that those materials get cleaned up on a fairly regular basis because spending more than a few days of a thick leaf cover on top of the grass surface, the grass underneath those leaves is going to start suffering and can even die out due to the cover, the lack of photosynthesis, and the trapped moisture up against the crowns. So when you've got trees coming down that drop over an extended period of time, make sure you take the time more than once a season to go out and rake up or blow away the leaves, or what I like to do in my lawn, simply have the mulching attachment on my mower and just mow over the lawn with the leaves on. It creates a nice mulch that'll help help feed the lawn as it goes. So besides very basic lawn maintenance, there are some larger care projects that fall is an ideal time to take on. Removing of thatch. So thatch is the stemmy buildup, the kind of brown stemmy buildup that occurs between the crown, right at the soil level, and the actual green tips. Lots of things can make more thatch buildup, poor soil biology, excessive fertilization, particularly too much phosphorus, again, in your fertilizers. All those things help increase the thatch load. The thatch load is essentially a dead area that is unsightly and doesn't promote good grass health. So stripping out the thatch and enabling the grass to kind of refill into that space can promote a lot of turf health. You can rent a power thatcher. It's kind of a slicing tool that goes through and tears into the soil surface and crown layer, as well as through the thatch itself, and just tears out those thatch layers. Really important to do that on a really big lawn, because the other option is usually use a rake, a hand rake, and rake through the thatch, and including, again, down into the crown slightly. And 1,000 square feet by hand rake, sure, you can do that. 5,000 square feet, you're probably not going to manage that by hand raking unless you're a lot more robust and persistent than I am. So taking out the thatch layers is beneficial for turf health. Another thing you can do is aerate. So when you're aerating, you're actually taking out a plug, a core of the soil. So don't use an aerator that's just a push-in point. That actually adds to soil compression over time, can create uneven layers of soil moisture. Use an aerator that actually takes plugs out. They make hand two-prong ones that you can do step down and pull out. Or you can, again, rent power aerators at rental companies to go through this. They look like a cross between a lawnmower and a tiller, and you push them in front of you and they pull out these plugs. So both of these projects do kind of tear up things a bit visually. You'll find that you have patchy areas that are really thinned down. You'll find you'll have a lot of debris from the thatch or those soil plugs sitting on the surface. You need to take a moment and actually rake those out and dispose of them, get them actually out of the turf. Then you can go back into your regular maintenance at that point. Now, especially after aeration, it's a really good idea to make sure that those nice cylindrical holes that you've made don't just fill back in with clay after the first rain. Our soils will tend to do that here. So you can get duration out of that dethatching by raking in a little bit of a sandy loam, or a sandy topsoil, or even bagged sand. And so then you pour that out on the areas you've already aerated, kind of rake it in to smooth, and it'll actually fill in those holes with a coarser material that then the holes don't just shrink. You can also use compost for that. Compost tends to diminish over time, where the sandy material is a longer term improvement. All of those improvements are suitable. After you have done a dethatching or an aeration, you can and raked it out and refilled the holes, you can then go ahead and look at liming, fertilizing, and reseeding. And likely after an aeration or dethatching, you're going to want to put a little more seed out there because it's going to look spotty and thin. These are beneficial chores. You really shouldn't do both the same season. You shouldn't both dethatch and aerate. It tears things up pretty good. Pick one or the other depending on what you're seeing in your turf as your priority task. If you're kind of tall, leggy, and stemmy, and a lot of the grass is just a little bit of green on the top and then flopping over so it looks kind of shabby, dethatching is a priority. If you have a compacted soil that either sheds water when you try to irrigate it, or puddles water in the winter, consider aeration as your primary chore, and then move forward. So whether you've aerated and dethatched, or whether your situation is simply you've got some holes, whether it's caused by fungal diseases, whether it's caused by insect, high foot traffic, dogs, whatever. Real common to need to do some fixing to the lawn. And so you want to make sure, if you're going to do some of this repair work, that you do any of the really high impact stuff first. So if you're doing weed control, because you're going to be looking at patching and seeding, you need to make sure that you have your weeds under control, and any herbicide use has been done way ahead so you don't have any impact on the new developing grass. If you're going to change your slope at all by filling or by cutting down, then make sure that's out of the way. Aeration, dethatching, all of those things get done before you look at the actual patching and seeding. The next step is, again, to fill in holes or divots left by physical damage or by aerating, cracks due to soil contraction in the summer from drying out, or irregularities, whether that's kind of a rolling irregularity of surface, or whether that's actually like divots that have sunken down or been pulled out when you pulled weeds out. Sandy loam is really essentially an ideal product for that, and typically it has enough organic mass in it to be sufficient with the sand. If you have substantially large areas of grade change, you may want to have more compost in with that sandy loam. In other words, if you're bringing in 3 or 4 inches of soil to actually change your slope, a straight sandy loam may be a little too quick draining for what you want. You want to make a little compost into that. Once you have your level established, and you can do that by raking in, then you can lime and feed. Again, standard liming, standard fertilization. If you're using winterizers or if you're using organic fertilizers, you can use them as part of your seeding project. And then you can put your seed down. Lime, fertilizer, and seed can all be done same day, one after the other, usually in that order, so you're not tracking more fertilizer around than you need to. If you have substantial bare areas and where you've either filled a lot to change your grade, or you have larger die-out areas that you're addressing, it's a good idea to cover that seed just like you would on a new seeding job. The thing about grass seed is it's a light sensitive germinator. So if you put a lot of compost on top of the seed, it's not going to germinate well. So really thin coating between 1/8 and 1/4 inch of compost, coir, peat moss makes a great little seed cover. Both keeps moisture down on the seed, keeps the seed pressed against the soil surface so it sets roots well, and helps keep the birds off of it long enough to germinate. The amount of seed you might need if you're patching and repairing is going to depend somewhat upon how thin or how patchy your problem spot is. Generally speaking, if you have some grass in an area and you have some thinness, you might be 2 or 3 pounds of grass seed per 1,000 square feet for fill, for patching. Larger bare patches, prorated accordingly, you can get as high as 4 or 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet if you have a lot of patchy or a very, very thin lawn. Once you have the lime fertilizer, seed, and cover down, you do need to put some water on it to settle it and to make sure you've got some moisture in that top seed coat layer. After that, you may need to do some supplemental irrigation depending on the weather. You don't want that seed to get completely dried out if at all possible, because dry seed stores. But once the seed has gotten wet and wants to start germinating, drying out during that germination cycle can very adversely affect how much grass seed germinates. Similarly, seeding a new lawn. If you have a new spot or you've basically changed your grade so much that you're essentially starting over, this is a great time to establish a new lawn in the fall. One of the big mistakes we see in turf care is the expectation that a minimal amount of soil prep will result in a good, long-lasting lawn. It won't. You do really need to kill any existing vegetation, weed, grasses, or little remnants of old turf before you start. There's no simpler way than herbicides, but you can also do it by hand, whether it's by torch or by hand control, turning the sod over upside down and letting it die back. But don't start a new lawn in a situation where you already have established weeds or undesirable grasses. People under-prepare their turf sites dramatically. To have a really healthy, persistent lawn, you need a root zone between 6 and 8 inches minimal. That doesn't mean 6 or 8 inches of clay before rock. That means decent soil, decent aeration, and decent drainage. So your answers to that are to build up new soil 6 to 8 inches deep, which is a very expensive undertaking, or add some compost and perhaps some sandy loam, and then till to a depth of 6 to 8 inches. So if you can put 2 or 3 inches of compost on top of the soil, till it to a depth of 6 inches and get it nice and level, that makes a suitable bed to establish a new lawn. Half measures will not result in failure. Half measures will result in less duration of decent lawn as it peters out because the conditions won't support it. Again, like with patch seeding, starting a new lawn, once you've got your soil prepped, you want to go ahead and lime, fertilize, and then seed. A starter fertilizer is ideal. A winterizer is fine, or organic lawn foods are all fine to start a turf. Cover the seed very lightly, 1/8 to 1/4 inch. I like compost. I find peat moss hard to hydrate and hard to keep hydrated. Coir I love, but it's pretty expensive per square foot treated. So composts are usually my easy go-to. As far as actually putting seed out, you have some limitations on your time frame. Excellent germination continues starting now all the way through roughly the middle of October. Past the middle of October, soil temperatures start declining significantly. In addition, we start getting the moisture coming in. And as those two factors together kind of slow the germination rate, but also speed up the decay rate, the percentage of seed lost to rot. So I don't want you to feel like you can't establish a new lawn or can't patch seed after October 15th, because you can seed in the Willamette Valley into January with reasonable success. You just need to understand that the later you're getting after that mid-October date, the less percentage of that grass seed is going to germinate, the more seed you're going to need to put down, and also the more you're going to fight it coming through the late winter and early spring until it's reestablished. So earlier in the season is better than too late in the season, even if that means you have to water a few times before the rains come in. There's a lot of options for grass seed. And there's a lot of what your selection comes down to is what your expectations are of the use of that grass. We won't go into huge details on all the varieties out there, but basically you see 3 main groups of lawn grasses in use here in the valley. You see perennial ryegrass. Perennial ryegrass is a really fast germinating, really fast growing turf that tolerates foot traffic quite well. It typically needs a bit more consistency of irrigation to look good in the summer, so it's a little thirstier. Being all ryegrass, it is also somewhat more subject to disease problems because there's no variances in grass there. It's all, even though it's a blend of different ryegrasses, it's all perennial rye. Be smart shopping for lawn seed. Trust a reputable nursery. Read the bags yourself if you're shopping at department stores. A lot of what's available in prepackaged bags is as much as 50% or even more annual ryegrass because it germinates. And it's annual ryegrass, annual bluegrass, the same thing. People spend millions of dollars a year trying to get that stuff out of their lawns as a weed. So in some parts of the country, it's the only way you do turf, and that's why you see it at the department stores, because they're national chain stores. You want your ryegrasses to be perennial ryegrasses here. Annual ryegrass are just going to be a fit that you're going to have to fight. The next type of common turf grass is a blended grass. So it'd be a blend of usually some perennial ryegrass with some type of creeping red fescue, a stoloniferous fescue. So the advantages to putting the fescue in are slightly better drought tolerance, significantly better shade tolerance. The drawbacks are they're not quite as aggressive as at filling in from competition, and they're a bit slower to germinate. So where ryegrass might germinate in that 7 to 10 day to maybe 14-day period, the fescue components of those mixes germinate more at 14 to 21, maybe even 28 days. So it takes a bit longer. You don't see a lot of straight creeping red fescue lawns. It is an option. It's usually handled different than typical urban lawns, though. Hard fescues are sometimes used as a standalone grass. Hard fescues have some shade tolerance, significant drought tolerance, and the ones that were specifically designed for turf use have pretty good foot traffic tolerance as well. They are a little bunchier, and you'll notice that in maintenance. They have just a little bit coarser texture because they're clumps rather than completely stoloniferous. That also means sometimes they don't compete well with other grasses or with weeds, so they're slightly less aggressive in that regard. So that's kind of the basics on maintenance. Let's talk a little bit about some of the problems you might run into and how best to address them. Insect issues. There's a variety of insect problems you might have in turf. In the fall cycle, our big one is the European crane fly. And that's the two bugs you see mating up there in the top picture. So there are other crane flies. Other crane flies are mostly not a serious problem simply because they don't maintain the population density of European crane fly. So the life cycle on European crane fly, we'll talk a little bit about because it really determines how you best manage this pest. So the adult crane flies emerge in the spring. They mate in this mid-spring into late spring, and they start laying eggs late spring and early summer. Those eggs hatch out in the summer, and the grubs, the larvae, start feeding on the grass roots. And they continue to feed through the summer and well into the fall. And depending on how late they're laying, so that's the beginning of the laying cycle is summer, but they continue to lay quite extensively into the summer. So there's a fairly staggered hatch of eggs and larvae of different ages in the soil. They continue eating into the winter before developing up into a red leather jacket type of pupa. So the issue with that is that simply, especially with the later hatches, you don't see the damage in the summer. Because they're just getting established, they don't have the population density yet, and they don't have the body size. They're not eating as much yet. Over the fall and winter, moisture comes in, they're continuing to eat. The grass doesn't usually show too many symptoms. And then late winter to spring, as we're starting to really push on hard again, suddenly you start having grass dying out and brown or yellow patches that are expanding, and the grass is completely dead in. So by the time you see these large patches, and it's a very typical pattern of damage you see down there in the bottom picture on the slide, the damage has already been done. You really can't control this season's damage anymore. But it's still valuable to know that you have that problem. If you had that problem in the past, you're likely to have that problem again going forward. So to control this pest, to manage this pest, it is really important to provide long-lasting control early in the season. So we normally start crane fly treatment sometime in August. There are long-lasting granular insecticides you can put down. They have either bifenthrin or imidacloprid, and they're systemic, so they absorb through the grass. For organic gardeners, you also have another option, nematodes, beneficial nematodes, which will eat the grubs in the soil. But as soon as possible, you need to get those treatments on. You're not too late to gain some ground now, but if you're looking at that, again, October, November, December and January, going into February, by the time you're hitting that late, a lot of the damage is done. So long-lasting insecticides early in the season. Now, sometimes, though, even those are not sufficient between the population density and the different periods of hatch. So sometimes we need to do a follow-up in the spring during that last spurt of growth before hatch. You can reduce your adult population some. You can do that with deltamethrin insecticides. The problem in the spring is you don't have enough soil temperature for the organic control options, the nematodes. So definitely, if you're thinking organic, keep a schedule going and get your nematodes out there. It's really your only effective organic control. So one of the things about crane fly and crane fly management is, yes, treat when you've got problems. Yes, treat when your neighborhood has problems, because they do tend to localize a bit. And of course, as you can see, the adult is a flyer, so they move around. You can reduce the habitat desirability of your lawn. So European cranefly loves moist soils and moisture areas. You'll typically see the worst damage in lower lying areas, not on the crowns of hills, but down the slope. So improving drainage reduces the viability of the insect habitat. A better control is, again, to simply set your mower high. So they have an ovipositor. The adult female has an ovipositor that drops its eggs down, ideally into the soil where they can hatch and the grubs can burrow down in the soil. When your grass is 3 to 4 inches long, a much lower percentage of those eggs actually make it down to soil and develop normally. The rest of them either fail or get eaten. So longer turf reduces your cranefly population, even if it doesn't completely eliminate it. You'll find that your cranefly problems predominate on turf that is well irrigated or sometimes over irrigated in the summer because, again, brown lawns are not as attractive to them. You cannot absolutely, however, count on avoiding cranefly problems by simply dormanting down your lawn. There's enough of them around that even if your habitat's not perfect, you may still see some. Okay, weed problems. So weed problems in a lawn break down into 2 basic groups. Grassy or grass-like weeds like crabgrass, orchard grass, annual ryegrass, and broadleaf weeds. They require different controls because they are not subject to the same herbicides. General purpose herbicides, this is Roundup, or organically, this is vinegar or capriic acid, dead weed brew. They kill everything they touch. They are a total vegetation killers. So you cannot spot treat weeds in your lawn without affecting the actual grass that you're hitting as well. They're still valuable for turf uses because obviously there are weed grasses, and sometimes it's the better option to simply knock back a larger patch and reseed rather than try to individually control every weed in tough weed situations, things like oxalis, for example. Broadleafs can be selectively controlled. There are a number of herbicides that affect broadleaf weeds that do not affect grasses and grass-like plants. These are typically forms of 2,4-D, triclopyr, dicamba for synthetic herbicides. They are designed to be used right in the lawn, kill the broadleaves, lawn is unaffected. There are limits to that. One of the big limits to that is weed and feed products. Weed and feeds have a fertilizer plus a granular broadleaf selective herbicide, and I really dislike them on a couple of grounds. First ground is that they're not superly effective. What ends up happening a lot is you have herbicide granules where you don't really need herbicide, and sometimes you don't have enough herbicide right where your weed problems are for good control. On a larger note, weed and feeds by their nature are mobile. They're water mobile and soil mobile. They have to be to work. So if you're weed and feeding your lawn and you've got trees in the lawn or trees around the edge of the lawn with roots that go into the turf, under the turf, shrubs that go under the turf, weed and feed will go through the soil and can damage or even kill your broadleaf plants that are desirable plants that are not even necessarily in the lawn. So I would much prefer when you're doing broadleaf weed control to see you spraying weeds with a selective herbicide, not using weed and feed products. We don't have any true organic broadleaf selective herbicides, but we do have some extremely less toxic options for sprays. Lawn Weed Brew is a iron-based product, HEDTA iron. And so iron products like that, grass doesn't really absorb them to the growing tip. Broadleafs do, and so they burn out the tops. They don't root kill. They burn out the tops of broadleaf weeds without damaging the grass around them if you follow the label directions correctly, because you can overdo. I'm using that in my lawn at home for dandelion maintenance, for example, and it's been pretty effective all in all. It does require repeat application. It doesn't kill the root, so you have to take several times of reducing the stored energy of that plant before it's really, really dead. Grassy weeds in a turf you basically have no real option for controlling them without damaging the turf around them. Yes, some of the liquid herbicides for weed control in lawns also have an annual grass killer. There's a couple of different ones that are mixed in there. They're only so effective at best, but they call them crabgrass killers, and you find them in the sprays pretty widely. Generally speaking, if you have a little bit of grassy weeds in the lawn, those products will give you reasonable suppression. If you have substantial patches of crabgrass, they will not give you adequate control. You will definitely be ahead to just kill out that patch completely and reestablish turf in there. You can reduce your weed problems. You can use pre-emergent herbicides. There are organic ones containing corn gluten, or there are synthetic ones usually containing either dimension or trimec or similar compounds that stop weed seed from germinating. They do not kill weeds that are already there. Still valuable if you can, as a maintenance tool, if you're keeping track of your seasonality, because a lot of the weeds follow the same cycle as the grasses with more development as the rains come in. General maintenance practices, maintaining consistent but irrigation that's neither overdone nor underdone, fertilizing and mowing regularly and high enough to avoid scalping. Those are things that will reduce your weed problems as well. You need to understand that when you're looking at a Better Homes and Gardens lawn, you are looking at a situation that is being artificially kept juvenile and intensively maintained. The natural tendency of an established grass area is to start out with a dominant grass species, to have additional broadleafs and other types of grasses move in, and to, over time, over years, develop a mixed ecosystem, which is fine if that's what you're looking for, but most people looking for a lawn don't want that. They want that juvenile, basically monotypic grass establishment. So you will always have to fight that to some extent. It's just part of the nature of the game. Moss is a real common turf problem here. So moss and grass generally have divergent needs. And if you're seeing a lot of moss in a struggling lawn, it's really time to ask yourself, do I really have to have turf here? Okay, because you're fighting against a site that is somewhat against grass. Now, that's not to say you can't make that work. You're just going to have to understand that you're going to be putting more effort into it and re-establishing fresh batches of grass on a more ongoing basis. So basically, mosses like moist to wet conditions that are acidic and often are at least partially shaded. Grass definitely prefers full sun, even on the shade-tolerant grasses, and likes its pH more neutral to even slightly alkaline. So situations where you have lots of moss and very little grass, usually one of those factors is quite a ways out of whack for grass preferences. When you have existing moss in a turf situation, you can control it with iron-based moss killers. Usually they're fairly heavy doses of iron. You can apply them through a liquid. You can apply them as a granule. Iron stains. So when you're putting moss killers on a turf situation, you need to make sure that you're not hitting the siding of your house, splashing it up, dropping granules on your sidewalk. You will have rust stains that do not go away if you have iron products on those hard surfaces. Once you have suppressed the moss and it will kind of turn browny black, you really should take the time to rake out the dead moss and expose the soil underneath before moving forward with improving the lawn. And then once you've got the moss out, lime. So lime does not kill moss, but liming consistently reduces moss because it creates less desirable conditions for the moss. Feed and get your grass going again. Again, another reason to mow high. If you can keep your turf 3 or 4 inches high, you'll have less development of moss underneath it than really struggling scalped grass, which just isn't as healthy. Diseases. I wish we could spend more time on diseases, but in practicality, we could spend hours just going over turf diseases. Lawns have a lot of disease susceptibility. There's a lot of potential problems you might run into. You'll have different lawn diseases that occur at different seasons of the year, depending on temperature and moisture level, usually. So there are whole books on the topic. If you really get excited about it, shoot me an email. We'll talk in more detail. But different diseases require different approaches to treatment. Broadly, the vast majority of the diseases we see in the turf around here are culturally induced and can be culturally solved. So there's sites that are too wet, too much of the year, have disease problems from fungal diseases. Lawns that are stressed from nutrient deficiency have groups of diseases. Lawns that are growing super, super fast, artificially stimulated, also frequently develop diseases. So a lot of times getting the right fertilization pattern and the right irrigation patterns can substantially reduce or even cure existing disease problems. So those really are our step ones in control. It is very, very, very important when you're trying to deal with a lawn disease situation to figure out which disease you are dealing with. I mentioned there's a lot of them look pretty similar. And if we don't get the right one, we might take the wrong direction. So, for example, there are diseases that tend to predominate when turf is very under-fertilized. And the solution to that is to pick up your feeding patterns. There are diseases that proliferate when grass is growing too aggressively. You need to back off fertilization. So getting identification is critical. So bring samples into your local nursery for an evaluation. We can at least narrow down the possibilities to 2 or 3 most likely candidates and give you some direction from there. Some situations do warrant treatment with fungicides. There are some granular and some liquid fungicides available. Just spraying a diseased lawn with a broad spectrum fungicide is usually not a super effective way of combating diseases. Figuring out what the problem is and dealing with the cultural causes really are more important. Some lawn diseases really aren't per se curable. It's one of the frustrations of doing this on a retail setting is communicating that information in a way that a consumer can understand. Fairy ring is probably the most common disease we see that is not a treatable situation. So fairy ring will look like a circle, usually bright colored. It can be bright yellow, can be running towards browns and expanding. Young cases of fairy ring will be dead in the middle. As that ring expands out, often you'll get tufts of very, very dark, lush looking grass in the middle of it. So you have this really dark patch with this dead or dying ring around it. Right? And over time, and this can be over months, this can be over years, that ring expands and expands and expands. So what's happening there is you have fungal organisms in the soil that are breaking down woody material in that soil, whether that's a layer of bark dust that got tilled in, whether that's an old stump, construction debris, where they left wood products in the ground and just covered it over. You can't fix that. You can't make that stop. What you do is you promote good lawn health through the process of that expanding out, diffusing, and dissipating. Once that material is broken down, the quote-unquote disease goes away. So diagnostics critical. Some things cannot be addressed quickly. A lot of them can be addressed quickly. It's not always about chemical treatments. In many cases, it is simply about changing maintenance practices. So it's kind of an overview on your fall lawn. You know, your lawn for next summer starts now at the beginning of its growing season. So if you take the time to really establish a good soil base to get your grass growing, feed, water, and mow appropriately, you'll have fantastic results going next year. That's what I had for you for my direct presentation at this point in time. I would invite you to either type some questions into chat or unmute yourselves and talk to me. I'd love to hear any questions. Okay, so question, how far should you separate your lime applications, your fertilizer applications? And that's an excellent question. The answer is, it depends. If you are working with a organic fertilizer, you can lime and fertilize right then, no problem. If you're working with a synthetic fertilizer, a non-organic lawn food, there are some advantages to separating them. Is it absolutely critical? No. So the separation period there is about 7 to 10 days. What happens with synthetic nitrogen forms going on in lawn fertilizers is that if you lime them, you start losing some of that nitrogen into the air rather than going down into the roots and affecting the plants. It is not a huge percentage, but it is there, so it decreases the efficiency. But with winterizers, it doesn't matter. And with organic fertilizers, it doesn't matter, but it does matter with the faster releasing spring and summer fertilizers. We didn't really talk about fertilizer scheduling so much as to say do it. In the fall, meaning September to October, we like to put down a winterizer or an organic fertilizer. We mentioned that. That usually lasts for somewhere between 3 and 4 months. And if you do the math, that means sometime around Christmas, you're kind of out of nutrients. Depending on what your underlying nutrient base was in that soil, you may need to do a second application, again, of either organic or fall and winter, right in that point, mid to late December. That will see you through till the spring. Once we get into really active lawn regrowth, as the temperatures come up in March and you're getting ready to the point where you're willing to go out and mow despite the periodic rains, that's when you want to then switch out. Again, you can stay organic. If you're doing organic, that's a wonderful approach. But if you're going a synthetic fertilizer and you want to push it a little harder, then you switch back to a regular lawn food that is not a winterizer, usually about March. All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to move on with my day. You guys know where to find me. If you have any follow-up questions, you can give me a call here at the nursery or shoot me an email. I'd love to respond. Thank you for attending. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you. Hey, Darren, I couldn't figure out how to unmute. What
Sure,
about
Mary.
those eco mixes? Do you treat those the same? You didn't, those that have a few flowers in them and stuff?
Okay, so what they call eco mixes or flowers and grass mixes and such. The basic overall is very similar, except obviously you're not doing broadleaf weed control because that would kill all the flowers. Mowing has to often be attenuated. Now, if you've got the really short ones where the flowers are super low, you know, it's all strawberry clover, Dutch white clover, and microbellus daisies. You can mow pretty much on your standard schedule as long as you're getting up there in that 3-inch range. On taller eco mixes, you'll take a pause in there when they're going through their flowering cycle and then setting seed, because you don't want to continually mow off the seed heads of those wildflowers. They will fail out at least over time. So typically what will be done with those, and those eco mixes are often not substantially irrigated anyway. You'll typically maintain them as regular in the spring, and then once you start seeing the flowers really pushing up, you'll stop mowing. Typically, you're not watering those anyway. You're going to let them go through their natural cycle, and so you won't be needing to mow because the grass won't be growing so aggressively. They'll go through their flower cycle, set seed, and then you can mow them again now with that low mowing, and that'll help set that seed back down into the soil where it germinates.
Okay, great. That gets me going. Thanks a lot.
Anytime, thanks.
Bye-bye.
You bet, thanks. So steps from liming to fertilizing. Go back through that real quick. So liming changes your soil pH, also makes nutrients more available. It is usually done as a supplement to fertilization. It can, in most cases, be done the same day as fertilizers, but with more active nitrogen sources, you might want to wait by a week between. So lime and fertilizer is usually done in that order because you don't want to be tracking fertilizer around. Tracking lime around is really not a huge issue. And that's kind of your basic set. Usually we'll lime either once or twice a year, spring and fall, or just fall. Fertilizing needs to be done on a more ongoing basis. So you can fertilize in those spring and fall cycles again, but you'll want to do some additional fertilization, particularly through the spring and early summer as you're maintaining that nice green lawn. I think, did we cover that question adequately, Paul, or do you have additional detailed questions on that?
Anyway, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, thank you all, and I will get on with my day, but don't hesitate to give me a buzz if you want more questions. Appreciate it.
Bye.